All right, guys. So tonight we are going to leave Jamestown behind us and begin looking at the Massachusetts colony. We're going to explore the Massachusetts colony, kind of similar to the way we explored Jamestown, looking at these motivations, the obstacles, and the accomplishments of the colony. And just look at Massachusetts, we're going to break it up into a couple parts. The first thing we're going to look at are the Pilgrims, the people who first came over and established this colony in Massachusetts. You've probably heard of the Pilgrims before. So to understand the Pilgrims, we first have to understand another group that they're a part of, and that's a group called the Puritans. The Puritans were a group that were critical of the Anglican or English church. So if you remember from your study in world history, there was the Protestant Reformation, and the Anglican church broke away from the Catholic church. The Puritans wanted to purify the Anglican church and get rid of all of what they saw as the Catholic rituals. So they wanted to purify the church from within. Some of the other beliefs that they had was that each person could read and interpret the Bible for themselves, and that this was the key to one's faith. Not necessarily, or not being a part of rituals like you would see in Catholicism and still saw parts of in the Anglican church. So these Pilgrims were a group of Puritans who wanted to get rid of these Catholic rituals, but they wanted to completely separate themselves from the Anglican church. So these Pilgrims were separatists. They wanted to break away from the Anglican church or the Church of England and establish their own church. So they're kind of a group of Puritans, but a group separate unto themselves in that they didn't want to purify the church from within, they wanted to purify the church from without. So in 1620, a group of pilgrims set sail on the Mayflower, and they arrived in Massachusetts. They were not the only group of people on the Mayflower. About half the group of people were pilgrims, and then the other half were just a group of settlers, a group that the Pilgrims called the Strangers. So they weren't pilgrims themselves and weren't necessarily Puritans themselves, people who were just coming over to America to start a new life. Almost as soon as the Pilgrims arrived, actually as soon as they arrived, they ran into some serious problems. First of all, many of them were already really sick from the voyage over. Also, they landed in the wrong spot. They were supposed to go to Virginia, but didn't. They landed in Massachusetts. They didn't have permission from the king to be in Massachusetts, so that was already another issue. And some people said that they didn't have to listen to the leaders since they were already in the wrong place. These were the group of strangers who said, we don't need to follow the pilgrim leaders. You guys have already brought us to the wrong place. You don't have authority here. And also they arrive in November. So it's already cold. They need food. They need shelter. They need fuel if they're going to survive a winter in New England. All right. So as the pilgrims are arriving in New England and they're encountering these problems, even before they land, they decide they have to figure out a way to deal with this. So they wrote and signed a really important document called the Mayflower Compact. This Mayflower Compact was an agreement amongst all of the men on the ship that they could elect representatives to make decisions for the general good of the colony, and that everyone had to obey to these just and equal laws. And this Mayflower Compact is really important because it is the first written framework for self-government in the American colonies. It is very similar to the House of Burgesses in a lot of ways, but we're going to discuss some ways that it's different. It's just important to understand. So just like we had the beginnings of self-government in Virginia with the House of Burgesses, we're also going to have self-government in Massachusetts through the Mayflower Compact. The big difference being this Mayflower Compact was a written document, and this was from the outset. From the very beginning, these pilgrims had established a form of self-government even before they technically set foot in Massachusetts. Okay, so now we're going to move on from just the pilgrims themselves and push forward a little bit in time, looking at the Puritans who were coming over. So between 1630 and 1640, so about a decade or so after the pilgrims arrived, about 20,000 Puritans are going to be coming to Massachusetts. And there's going to be lots of reasons why. First of all, they were unhappy with the king. They still wanted to purify the church from within, but they're unhappy with the progress that the king was making. So they wanted to be able to worship in their own way, based on their own principles. And they didn't feel like they were able to do that in England. So they came over here to hopefully be able to worship the way that they wanted to. And the final reason they came over was they wanted to set an example for others. There's this famous speech that's given at the time, and it refers to America or to Massachusetts as a city on a hill. This shining example of the way life could be if you lived it according to the correct principles. So the city up on a hill that everybody could look at and admire and see, oh, that's how things should be done. And so Puritans were really motivated to come over and take part in this shining city on a hill. The Puritans had set up a government based on a charter, which was a license from the king. And the way it worked was that each town was governed by the male church members. The town chose a member of the general court, which is like the House of Burgesses, that wrote the laws for the colony. And at first, the general court elected the governor, but then the male church members voted for the governor individually. And the governor would serve a one-year term. So in many ways, this was a more democratic system than what we saw in the House of Burgesses, because any male was able to participate in these town meetings, which governed the town, and then any male was able to directly vote for the governor, whereas in Virginia, the governor was an appointed official who really had more power than the House of Burgesses. It's important to understand, though, that this is limited to church members. You had to be a member of the Puritan church to be able to vote. All right. These communities in Massachusetts are growing, and sometimes they would become too crowded. So if this happened, any group of settlers could apply to the general court to set up their own town. There were certain requirements, though. You had to have at least 20 families, and you had to have a Puritan minister who would come with you, and because the whole society is based kind of around the church. So if your request was approved, you were given a large piece of land on which to establish your town, and then the people of your town, through their town meeting, could decide how to distribute the land that they were given any way that they liked. So the final part we're going to look at is life in Massachusetts. So what was it like to live in Massachusetts? In Massachusetts, everyone is part of a town. It's very different from Virginia, where we have these large farms that are all spread out, these plantations. In Massachusetts, everything's centered around smaller communities called towns. And if a town had 50 or more families, it was required to have a free public school. This is a small one-room schoolhouse, not like a large K through 12 type school you guys are used to. Just one room where all the children of all ages would come and learn up to a certain age. Life in the town was run through the male church members. All right, they had regular town meetings, and male church members were basically making the decisions for the town. All eligible males could speak about important issues. Eligible means a church member. They would choose officials to run the town, and they voted on taxes and laws. They would also decide how land would be given out. And because it's Puritan communities, they also provided money and land and materials for a church. So the government in each town was run through these town meetings, and you had to be a male church member to be able or to be eligible to participate in these town meetings. As a citizen in one of these towns, you were expected to do your share of work to help the town. So you had to help with building fences, repairing roads, defending the town against any possible attacks. So that's where this picture comes from. This is a Minuteman statue. So you had to be part of the town militia in times of danger. And people who were not Puritans could live in the town, but they weren't allowed to vote, and they couldn't hold office. So in Massachusetts, the democracy was limited to just church members. And that leads us to tonight's response question. So, based on what you've learned so far, what are some similarities and differences between the Virginia and Massachusetts colonies? If it's helpful, you can think about motivations, obstacles, and accomplishments. If it's helpful, you can also think about the five founding ideals: opportunity, liberty, democracy, equality, and rights. So, what are some similarities and differences between the Virginia and Massachusetts colonies?